Perfect. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this housing town hall this evening. I appreciate you all coming on, your time. I know it's right after work for a lot of you, so definitely thank you for taking the time and joining us. My name is Ross Maza. I am a Alhambra council member for District 2, which is the southeast portion of the city, corner of the city, which a lot of you may be familiar with, but to those who are not, that is the general region which our District 2 encompasses. So we have with us tonight Mr. Chris Blackney, who is our consultant, and will be discussing with us our regional housing needs assessment numbers and how that relates to, of course, our housing element, which we are currently working on. And of course, he's going to talk with us about some possible options, solutions in facing this challenge of such a large number for us. So we are going to have time for questions towards the end of the presentation. There is also a Q&A portion down at the bottom of your screen if you are joining us by Zoom. And of course, if you are joining us by telephone, if you would like to speak, you can press *9. And of course, once you've given the chance to speak, you can press *6 to be able to unmute yourself. So with that, again, we'll come back. We'll have an opportunity for questions, answers, discussion. But I would like to now turn it over to Mr. Blackney for his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Yeah, so I'm Chris. I'm with Echo Northwest. We are a leading economic consultancy on the West Coast, and I run our branch down here in Los Angeles. One more matter of logistics, we will have a short poll. And so there will be a box that pops up on your screen. You have the opportunity to be a couple of poll questions. We'll guide you through those. So you'll have the opportunity to respond to that poll as well. So just going into a brief presentation, if you're here today, there's a lot going on in Alhambra. In 2019, the city updated did a full update to its general plan. And there are 3 studies going on concurrently right now. One is a study of the East Main Corridor. Another one is a comprehensive zoning code update project. And then the project that I'm working on is the housing element update, which is a component of the general plan. And we'll get into that here in a minute. So, but first I'd like to kick us off with a brief summary of RHNA. So if you're here today, you've likely heard of this term before, and you want to know a little bit more about what it is. So we're going to start today with a little bit of RHNA 101. So RHNA stands for Regional Housing Need Allocation. And so first, it's a process. It's a statewide process to determine housing need on 8-year cycles across the state. In different regions throughout the state are on different timelines. San Diego's already done, Sacramento's wrapping theirs up, and San Francisco, for example, is just getting ready to kick off their process. Here in Alhambra, our cycle will run from October 2021 to October 2029. RHNA is also a number. It's the number of units by a level of affordability that represents Alhambra's fair share of regional housing need. It's also a planning target, which is often confused with a requirement for production. But RHNA is actually a target for zone capacity, not actually building or constructing housing units. So how does this allocation process work? So the state of California determined that for this cycle, there was a shortfall across the state of 3.5 million units. And it went through a process of identifying where those should go throughout regional areas across the state. The SCAG region was allocated 1.34 million units of that total. So quite a bit. But that happened back in 2019. And so then SCAG is tasked with developing its own methodology for how it allocates those units down to its representative jurisdictions. And by that methodology that was developed, Alhambra ultimately ended up with a number of units that is 6,825 housing units that represents its share of regional housing. So in this in this table here, we're showing a couple of things. We're comparing the RHNA fifth cycle, which ran from 2013 to 2021. We're actually still in the fifth cycle, to the RHNA sixth cycle. And there are a couple of observations we have here. The first is you can see that we had this really, really big jump in RHNA between the last cycle and current cycle. For Alhambra, that represents about a 450% increase. We're also seeing here that the RHNA is not just a single number. It's not just 6,825 units. It is capacity that needs to be allocated across sites that are suitable for lower income households as well. And these are households that earn 80% of or less of median income in the region. And that is about 31%, excuse me, 41% of total housing need allocated to lower income. In this slide, what we're showing is that Alhambra is not alone or is not being singled out with this big jump in its number. As a percentage of existing housing units, Alhambra's RHNA is about 22%, which is about middle of the pack for peer cities in the San Gabriel Valley. So whenever I give a presentation like this, I'm often asked, like, why is this RHNA so high? What was the impetus behind this happening? And the major reason is that over the last 20 years, California has exhibited chronic underproduction for housing. And this is a problem statewide, and it's also a problem here in the San Gabriel Valley. So the fact is we just haven't had enough housing production to keep up with population and household growth. And so when that happens, it leads to a number of problems. The first among which is absent equal growth in incomes, there's price increases associated with underproduction. And so when you have price increases without income increases, you have a larger share of the population that have to spend too much money on housing. And we call these cost burden households. And in Alhambra, sadly, 1 in 3 households are experiencing cost burden in some way. It also leads to overcrowding. So to get around cost burden, people double up, put more people in homes than they otherwise would. This results in what we call overcrowding. And so in Alhambra, the overcrowding is when there's more people living in a home than there are actual rooms in that home. And in Alhambra, 1 in 6 households are experiencing this. And both of these rates are higher than the typical averages across the region. So the project that I'm working on is called the housing element, and it relates directly to RHNA and the RHNA process. And I'm just going to briefly go through what this project actually is and how it addresses RHNA. So the housing element is actually a component of the general plan, which you can think of the general plan as like the instruction manual that guides decisions that the city makes on a number of areas, from transportation to open space to land use, and in this case, housing. The housing element guides decisions and programming around housing for the city over the planning cycle. And unlike other general plan elements, the housing element is required to be updated on this 8-year planning cycle by the state. And it's also the only element of the general plan where the state of California has the authority to review and certify it. That's done through California's Department of Housing and Community Development. So discussions around housing often center around this question of yes, more housing and no more housing. It's important when we talk about the housing element that we're not talking about that. It's not yes or no, because in fact, the actual amount of housing, as we just covered in RHNA, has been determined on the city's behalf. And so the housing element is really the process that the city goes through to determine where housing should go, what type of housing is suitable for this community, and how the city can plan for that, keeping in mind that there's a target that we're effectively required to hit. So the housing element has a number of chapters or components to it, or subcomponents to it. The first is it's an assessment of housing needs. So we go through and we take a look at existing issues in the community, demographics, housing growth, all these different things, and try to identify where there is need across income categories, where there is need for seniors or people with special needs, quantify the amount of homelessness in the community. So that it serves as a baseline for when we start to develop strategies to alleviate some of those things. We also do a constraints analysis. So we take a look at both governmental and non-governmental constraints that could be limiting housing production. We also go through and do a very detailed site-by-site inventory in the community of sites that cumulatively will have the zone capacity to accommodate this RHNA planning target. So we take a look at sites that are vacant, we take a look at sites that are non-vacant and potentially underutilized. We ensure that they're distributed fairly evenly throughout the community in accordance with state law. And then finally, we develop a plan. We go through and we review the city's previous policies and programs, take an assessment of how effective they were. And then we make recommendations on new policies and programs that can both address the capacity issue around meeting the city's RHNA mandate, but also respond to potential constraints on housing and addressing needs, housing needs that we've identified throughout this process. So I alluded this previously, but it's always worth referencing again. RHNA and the housing element do not pose a mandate for actually building units in development. The intent of the process is that by having a plan in place that removes barriers to development, that has adequate zone sites with realistic capacity to accommodate development, and taking meaningful steps to institute policies and programs that promote housing development, the market has the opportunity to operate, to function and operate efficiently. And in that case, then there should be some realized development that occurs within the community consistent with the housing need targets. So I'm obviously asked, well, what if we say no? What if we say, hey, this is a big number. It's a significant amount of change in our community. It's too big. We don't want to do it. So what happens? Well, housing policy is a world of carrot and sticks, and there's a penalty if the city does not go through this process and get certified. The first is that the city would be deemed to have an incomplete general plan, and that would open the city up for litigation risk. It could be sued by developers or advocacy groups. And in fact, even the state of California could sue the city for not having an updated, consistent general plan. It would also make the city ineligible for the carrots. By instituting this larger number on jurisdictions, the state has also provided a significant amount of funding for jurisdictions to institute a range of programs that are very important to the city. So not having an updated general plan, or excuse me, housing element would result in a loss of that funding. And it also means that we'll be doing this again in 4 years instead of 8. So instead of right now, the city, if adopted and is compliant with the state, won't have to do this again for eight years. If we fail that, then we will be doing it again in 4. And the RHNA that has been identified for this cycle effectively gets rolled over to the next cycle. So you can think about it as kicking the can down the road and like, oh, we'll address this problem later. It's just going to have that much larger of a magnitude of an issue when we have to do it again in 4 years. So that kind of brings us to where we are today. We're working through some housing solutions, and I think, yeah, so that's where we're at. So we've got as we've been working through this project, we have started to work through some potential solutions and approaches that that the city can take to address many of these concerns that we're identifying in the project, or excuse me, in the community. And I'll walk through a few of those real briefly. But first, let's talk about the magnitude of what we're talking about, just to provide some context. As many of you know, Alhambra is a largely built out community. There's hardly any vacant land. And redevelopment is much harder than developing vacant land because you have to account for the existing use, which has value and makes it more difficult to develop properties. This makes it really hard in communities like Alhambra that are landlocked. And so our initial analysis has identified existing development and capacity potential for redevelopment of sites for about half of what has been allocated to Alhambra for its RHNA at best. And so this means we have a shortfall of about 3,000 to 4,000 units that are going to have to be addressed through policy and programming changes. So to understand what this means, just for some perspective, 3,000 to 4,000 units at existing densities that are allowed in high densities areas in the community equates to an area about the size of the Alhambra golf course if it was all put in one spot. So we have to think about what that means for taking an area that large and distributing it throughout the community so that we're not disproportionately impacting one area or another. And so there's a number of ways. So where and how, housing capacity, how has to go somewhere. What are some of the things that the city is starting to look at? And I will preface this that these are for discussion purposes. There has not been any decisions made on where and how yet. That's what this process is about. It's where we get feedback from the community and feedback from staff and walk through these potential alternatives together. And so the first one is what I call subtle densification. And so this is where you're taking a look at minor changes in lower density areas through things like accessory dwelling units, allowing duplexes on corner lots, small changes in existing single family neighborhoods that would result in, I use the analogy of spreading the butter across the bread a bit more thinly as opposed to having it in kind of one spot or the other. We also talk about looking into upzoning in low and medium density areas. So these are areas where there's existing low and medium density housing allowed, but we take a look at taking it up a level. So what happens if we allow slightly more density in the same amount of space? What does that mean in terms of additional capacity that we can fit and triggers for redevelopment opportunities? We also take a look at encouraging higher density development in the downtown core. So this would result in larger buildings, more density concentrated within areas that are more suitable for that type of change in development form. We also take a look at encouraging higher density in existing downtown, in the downtown core and existing corridors. So these are your commercial corridors where there's housing already allowed to a certain extent. We look at upzoning existing higher density areas. So these are areas that have already been designated for high density residential development. And we look for ways that we can help encourage redevelopment and higher densities within these pockets already deemed appropriate for more density. And then finally, we take a look at opportunities to allow housing in areas where housing is not currently allowed. And Councilmember Maza, this one is probably most pertinent to the constituents in your district. If you take a look at the map, several of the corridors we're talking about where housing is not currently allowed, most of Valley Boulevard on the east and Garfield are in your district. So it's important to have these conversations as we're going through this. So that's the end of my presentation. I know we have a poll that we're going to put up, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that.
Sure.
So, with that, all the information that you put together, you presented. Why don't we put that poll up and give people an opportunity to go through and answer, the questions and give their opinion on that poll. And of course, we'll come back towards the end of the presentation and go through the results of the poll. So if everyone that's with us tonight can go through and start answering the questions going through, we'd appreciate it. And we'll be back in just a couple of minutes here.
Sure. And while you guys are answering those questions, I can just work through some of these and provide some context. So to this first question, subtle densification generally has a trade-off in the sense that it's associated with less intensive changes, but it impacts a larger area of the community. And one of the ways that we're thinking about doing this, and to be frank, it's one of the things that the state is promoting, is doing that through promotion of accessory dwelling units. And accessory dwelling units, if you're not familiar with the term, is like what you think of as like a guest house. It could be a garage conversion or a smaller structure that's on a lot that has existing land area to fit an additional building on. They are actually allowed outright in the city, so they're currently allowed in the city. So we are, this question would be what steps the city could take to help kind of further and promote that through incentives or other things. And I see someone asked a question about the third question. The third question is not intended to be a yes or no. Please, as you get to that one, and I'll go through in a moment, type into the Q&A box your response to that. And I'll just jump over to that real quick. To that question, one of the things we're really wanting to ask is if the city is considering adding housing in zones where it's not currently allowed, like what areas should the city be exploring? And for this question, please write it in the chat. But you know, some of the things, as I mentioned, we're looking at is the larger sections of Valley Boulevard, the Garfield corridor, industrial areas in the western part of the city, the East Main corridor, or any site. If there's a site that you are familiar with or an area that we haven't talked about or presented, please, we welcome any and all input on and want to hear your ideas on where you think housing would be appropriate in the community. And then jumping back to the second question, another approach that we could use to increase capacity, as I mentioned, is allowing more density or changing the development standards in existing residential areas. This means that more homes would be allowed in the same physical amount of space. And depending on the magnitude of the change required, this could result in a change in the built environment. So you might see a cottage cluster or a low-rise apartment in some medium density areas, or you could see taller buildings in existing high density areas like downtown. Actually, your district, District 2, has seen I would say the most significant amount of activity in the city of this kind of subtle densification in the R3 zone around the Stoneman district. There's a lot of sites around there that has been, or the Stoneman neighborhood, excuse me, a lot of sites there that were identified in the previous housing element cycle as potential redevelopment sites that actually have redeveloped. And so you're seeing 1-2 homes being torn down with kind of 6 or an infill lot with 5 or 6 cottages being put in its place. And it's an example that we've used as a potential way that the city can get more units, but not have these really huge, meaningful changes in form. So we'll take a few more minutes for the poll, and then we'll jump into some Q&A, I believe.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And just want to clarify as well. I saw a question or a comment down about question number 3 on the poll, that there was obviously no way to input text into the poll. And your answer there, just to clarify, would go into the question and answer box down at the bottom of the screen. Thank you.
So I'm seeing that we have 9 of 15 respondents so far that have addressed some of these questions. So perhaps we give them a few more minutes, and if we don't see an uptick, then we can proceed.
And I am seeing a comment as well that for some of those that may be on by phone versus Zoom, they were unable to type anything into the for question number 3. So perhaps what we can do towards the end is unmute those callers if they will raise their hand by pressing *9, and then they can give us their answer as to their thoughts on question 3.
And also for the caller or that's on your phone and you cannot respond, if you haven't already, this project has a website. It's Alhambra housingelement.com, and you could link to it through the city's website as well. Go there, anybody actually that's participating in this process, please go there and click on the Get Involved tab. It has a sign-up sheet where you can get updates about the project. It has information about the project schedule, upcoming events, past events. We've done a community workshop already, and there's some project materials that you can view there. So if you could solicit input, so to the caller that can't respond to question 3 in the chat, sign up and send us an email. We'd be happy to take your input that way as well. And with that, I don't think we're seeing any additional responses here. So maybe we close the poll and proceed to some Q&A.
Let's definitely do that. So at this point, why don't we give everyone a chance to either type any questions that they may have into the Q&A. Of course, again, it's a reminder for those of you who are calling in by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand, and then you will be unmuted for any questions that you may have in just a moment. So let's give it a couple moments for any questions that might come through. So I guess we can get started, Chris, as the questions are coming in. We have one question, or I guess it looks like maybe a comment here from Mr. Lewis McCammon. And it says, regarding question 3, the city needs to look very carefully at the city-owned golf course land. There are other public golf courses very nearby in South Pasadena, Monterey Park, Montebello, Pasadena, total of 3, Azusa, Whittier Narrows Golf Course. And so that was a comment. Thank you for that comment, Mr. McCammon. We'll certainly take that into consideration and make sure that that is addressed. Next, we have ACO, and it's more of a comment, it looks like. I would like to see rezoning in the commercial areas for mixed-use housing. The issue is parking in the medium to high-density residential areas, since it's difficult to park with the city's overnight parking restrictions. Thank you, ACO, for that. This is, of course, being recorded, and we'll take this into consideration, make sure that is addressed as well. And then we have another comment from Susie Dunkel Soto regarding question 3. It says, change zoning in industrial commercial where transit is accessible. Thank you for that.
I think just as a reminder to the folks participating, if you would like to speak, if you use the raise hand feature, we can enable your audio, and you're welcome to comment audibly or ask questions that way as well.
So in the meantime, Chris, why don't I just, I'm gonna ask you a question that's been asked of me multiple times when I'm out in the community, and you addressed this, in general terms a second ago, but I'd like to ask again and just clarify for some of our callers and people who are on with us tonight. So since the housing element and the RHNA numbers are not a mandate per se, what happens if they aren't met? I mean, what are some of the, and I think you mentioned, regarding the element, I mean, that there could be some penalties, some resources that we'll miss out on, but in terms of building, what are some of the consequences or alternatives?
Sure. So so to clarify, there it effectively is a mandate, and it's not generally recommended that jurisdictions don't comply. I know there are some that are observing and that their number is they're arguing that their number is not plausible, and there are communities that are looking at what those alternatives are. To reiterate from my presentation, the city could be sued by the state, it could be sued by developers, pro-housing advocacy groups, loss of funding, and then the 4-year penalty is one of the big ones, because you end up having to go through this process again. As a consultant, I don't mind that, but it's an expensive process, so I don't recommend that you do it. but yeah, and then to the latter half of your question there, sir, about what happens if we fall behind on building. That is not a mandate. It's not a mandate to build actual units, but when a jurisdiction starts to fall behind on the actual production of units in relation to its RHNA allocation, then it starts to lose control over the types of projects that it approves. And so there's a process by which a qualifying project could be approved without the city's oversight, so long as it met development standards and things of that nature. It's effectively called streamlined permitting and processing, and so that would start to factor in for qualified projects.
Thank you. And I know some of these larger numbers, in this new cycle, they're relatively new. Have you been, obviously in your exposure to all this, have you been aware of any cities in Southern California and California in general that may have lost a little bit of control with regards to their project oversight in the past?
To be most jurisdictions are affected cities that did not meet their mandate or their fifth cycle reallocation. Even that smaller number, most cities throughout the state of California didn't, and so that is one of the reasons why the state of California has gotten really serious about this process to ensure that jurisdictions are making meaningful efforts to add zone capacity that can, and given, like I said, given carrots and given incentives and given money and resources to help execute on those plans more so than they have in the past.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's certainly always a concern for us. And, even when we're talking about, you identifying, I guess, suitable locations for only half of those numbers that are being mandated. This is in an 8-year period, 4,000 units, when I think we've built a total of maybe 1,900 units in the last 2 decades in Alhambra. So, I mean, when you're looking at the numbers, it's considerable. And this has to be looked at, of course, rather carefully. So as we're waiting, let's see if we have any other questions. If not, I'll ask some questions that I had here. So we have a comment from ACO, and it says, okay, this is more of a technical question, I guess. Moving on, Shirley Tatsuno asked or mentions, I agree with Lou about the golf course. So that's just a comment. We have an anonymous attendee who says, what are the best strategies other cities use that are similarly sized and similar number? What is most commonly done? So Chris, I'll let you answer that if you would.
Yeah, so in the SCAG region, people are still working through this. And so I don't have a definitive answer for like what's been successful because we haven't gotten to that point yet. But some things that we are looking at with jurisdictions that we're working with and that we've observed is, obviously we talked a bit about ADUs. ADUs are a way to increase density in a large part of the city without making super meaningful impacts on development form within certain areas. We're seeing commercial corridors are a common thing. So looking at strategies to upzone and allow more density in along commercial corridors and commercial areas. Increases in relational increases in density and height that allow you to get more allow redevelopment to happen. And it's effectively the things that we're looking at for Alhambra. And then looking at underutilized areas where housing is not currently allowed and saying what would happen to the development form if you allowed housing there, and what type of redevelopment could occur. There's other things that the city can do that are not necessarily zoning and design standard driven, things like reducing parking standards or incentives, or when it comes to affordable housing, some jurisdictions are creating affordable housing trust funds and ways to subsidize development. The city is actually doing this for affordable housing right now. There's 2 projects where city-owned property is being developed for affordable housing. So those are the things we're generally seeing.
Great, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. And going back to ADUs, I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot with this question. It may be more for Alhambra city staff, but you may know, do you have any idea of what the applications are for ADUs in Alhambra, 2021 or 2020 versus when it started in 2017 by chance?
So anybody that would like can go to the city's website, and the city actually produces I believe it's an annual report on ADU production, and I believe it's posted on the city's website. I know that we, as a part of our process, we took an inventory of ADUs that were developed or under construction between 2017 and 2019. And we found about 50 properties in total that had an ADU developed. Now there's a bit more that are in an application process or pending review or waiting on a permit. But those were the ones that had received a permit and were either under construction or completed.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And I know this is, of course, relatively new to a lot of people. I mean, there are many residents who aren't even aware that this, possibility exists to create, additional housing on their parcels. But, of course, we see it increasing as time goes by. So thank you for that. Let me look at, we have another question from Susie Dunkel Soto, and it says, what process is the city using to educate the residents on consequences of not meeting RHNA numbers? We want to keep local control, not lose it to state. So don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that, Chris, but what I can say is, that education is vital, very important that everybody be aware, be informed as much as possible. And of course, that is one of the reasons for tonight's town hall, is to make it one of many future online or maybe even live meetings where we educate the general public. But Chris, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think you said it exactly right. We've gone through a public engagement process as a part of this project in an effort to try to educate the community as much as possible. Our project website has a RHNA 101 memo that we've written and has some information and links to resources about this process. We have done a community workshop meeting in February that was very well attended, and then it's a good segue actually into how this process is going to evolve over the next several months. As you mentioned, we'll be doing these town halls. This is the second of 5 town halls that we'll be doing between now and this time next week. So if you want to hear this presentation again for some way to help you fall asleep at night, you're welcome to come along and listen to me talk again. So we'll be doing that, and then when we come up with a draft report, there will also be a opportunity for the city or for the community to review that report and provide public comment. And so there'll be a public review process where that document is made public, and then we're able to take additional input and feedback and work that into our findings before ultimately we take the resolved document and we hand it over to HCD, and they make a determination on how compliant we are with state law.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. We have another question from an anonymous attendee, and it says, if we're already park poor, why would we want to take the golf course for housing and not share use for community? So again, don't know if you have any thoughts on that question, Chris.
Well, this commenter is correct in the sense that Alhambra does have a lower than average share of park and open space relative to the size of the community. And so anytime we make decisions about where housing should go, and I've tried to frame it as such in this presentation, that it's, for me, I think about it as trade-offs. So if you are taking a portion of a golf course or a city property and allocating that to housing, there's a trade-off associated with that, but then you're not having to put that burden of housing somewhere else in the community. So that's why it's important to have these conversations and work through them as a community, and ensure that we're understanding and weighing those trade-offs against each other in a way that results in the best, the most appropriate and best outcome for the city.
Absolutely. Thank you. And, I can say that for myself as a council member, I'm certainly open to at least a discussion and possibilities of considering any viable space, for housing. Ultimately, we're going to weigh the pros and cons, benefits, et cetera. of these locations. And, as a group, five-member council, with the help of the community and community input, of course, aside, if that would be suitable or not, or if some of these locations may be suitable or not. But again, I appreciate the question. We have a comment, it looks like, from John Browery, and it says the Alhambra Main Street Alliance will be hosting a housing summit in May, and we encourage all community members to attend. We'll be bringing in state and regional leaders to raise these important issues. I think that's great. The more information that we can provide to the community, as much as possible, as often as possible, it is always welcome. It's helpful. I think it educates us all, and it helps, just give us a general idea of, where we stand as a community with the needs and of course, opinions on this housing. So thank you. I would love to be a part of that, and hopefully we can connect and align on some timing. So thank you for that. Shirley Tatsuno says, I just reviewed a webinar today of combining earthquake retrofit and ADUs for multi-units. Some ideas are replacing parking carport with ADUs, converting a garage or storage areas. So I'll comment on that real quick, and then I'll turn it over to Chris as well. I think it's a great idea. It's just being creative on possibilities that we may have not had before. ADUs, from my experience with them, definitely give some flexibility to creating housing that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So that is an example right there. When the ADU ordinance came out back in 2017, it was rather limiting or limited versus today, 2021, converting, storage or parking in multifamily units is a possibility. I've seen a few of those being done in different areas. I believe I've seen it in Inglewood, some cities in the West Side, Los Angeles. So, great idea. And it just creates other possibilities with a lot of flexibility in getting these done. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, so we, as I mentioned earlier, we've been pouring through the ADU data and trying to get an understanding of what works and what doesn't. And, of the 50 properties that I discussed earlier, half of them have been some form of garage conversion or expansion. So you're seeing folks that are taking a portion of a garage and turning it into an ADU, or tearing a garage down and building a new garage and an ADU with it. One thing that came out of the last town hall I wanted to have an answer for, of those properties, 26%, so only about 1/4 have been properties where the parking has gone away. So it's either an addition onto the property or a rebuild of the garage. Most of the properties in Alhambra have sufficient space to include both the existing parking structure and some form of accessory dwelling unit. And ADUs is something we're taking a close look at because it aligns with some of the housing needs that we've identified in Alhambra. Alhambra is a community that has an above average rate of multi-generational housing, so 3 generations or more living within the household. ADUs lends itself very well to that social dynamic, and so whenever we see something where a potential solution that exists in the community with respect to the built form aligns with a need, we think of that as a win.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. We have a comment from Mr. Lewis McCammon, and it says the golf course is not public parkland. Part of it could be converted to parkland and housing. So thank you for that. And again, definitely, as far as myself goes in District 2, I am certainly always open, and not only District 2, but just across the city, open to different possibilities, and at least taking a look at options and possibilities that may be in front of us. We have a question from ACO. Says is it allowed, it looks like, to apply for a change of use permit in Alhambra to convert an empty commercial property into residential in a commercial zone?
Yeah, that's a site-specific question. If housing is allowed on as an allowed use, then the redevelopment proposal would have to comply with those standards that are put forth. But this process, in addition to the zoning code update, is taking a look at how those regulations could be applied in a broader range of the community to allow for redevelopment of housing in a broader spectrum of the community. If this is a site that doesn't allow housing right now, it's a candidate for that change in the future. If housing is currently allowed, then there's some things that have to go with that. And if it's in a commercial zone, it's likely has to include some amount of mixed use associated with it under current regulations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And so of course, it goes back to the possible rezoning that may be taking place soon. Of course, we're working on, for it as an example, a specific plan for East Main. And so I think some of us on council, or hopefully most of us, have recognized that, there's definitely a need for housing, and that housing has to be evenly distributed, across the entire city, wherever those opportunities and viable locations are available. So I think everything is definitely a possibility at this point in time. And, hopefully once that rezoning takes place, it'll open up, other possibilities, other locations. There's one question also that I have on my list here that's been asked several times, and maybe we can address it. So can the city do anything about RHNA? Is there a process to challenge this mandate? So I'll just kind of open it up here and say that the city of Alhambra did appeal the current RHNA numbers of 6,900 plus units. And we were officially denied the appeal. So the effort was made. And it seems at this point that number is there to stay. There's really not a whole lot that can be done about that. I believe that other local cities such as South Pasadena and Pasadena, at least two others that I know of, also appealed the RHNA numbers and were denied the appeal. So not sure if you can expand upon that a little bit, Chris.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about appeals. And so, as I mentioned previously, the SCAG region was allocated its 1.3 million units back in 2019. There was actually an appeal process there as well, where Alhambra participated with many jurisdictions in the SCAG region alongside SCAG to appeal that number to the state. And that appeal was by and large unsuccessful as well. That number did not change much. And then SCAG went through the process of developing its methodology. Well, there was an appeal process associated with that process. And so when Alhambra got its first number of 6,809 units, I believe it was at the time, they participated in that appeal process alongside, I think, 50-ish other jurisdictions in the SCAG region. I think all but two were denied. And the two that were not denied were very, very small changes in their RHNA numbers. And so to your point, sir, this number is fixed now. The appeals process has come and gone, and we can effectively take it as canon at this point.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. So at this point, we are nearing the 1 hour mark. We've got about 10 minutes left, roughly. Hopefully we have the results of the poll available and they can be shared on screen. So Van, if those are available, perhaps you can help us out. Thank you.
All right.
Great. Chris, do you want to take it from here?
Sure, I can take a look at this. So to our first question about taking a more aggressive approach in terms of promoting ADUs, it seems like of our 9 respondents, 8 thought that was a good process or a good path to explore further and to potentially include in our analysis. And so it's good to see that there's some community support for that. That's generally consistent with what we've seen in other town halls and outreach. Our second question here was, do you think the city should explore changes in zoning that add density to existing medium and high density residential areas? And again, 7 of 9 of our respondents here responded in the affirmative to that question. So so it seems to me like there is, when I see results like this, it's pretty indicative that the community is understanding at least the magnitude of this mandate and what it's going to mean. And so I think it's encouraging to see people understanding that there are some changes that are likely to have to be made, and it's a positive sign that we have a solid dialogue that we're able to have to come up with an appropriate strategy for that. The third question is just was what we saw in the respondent boxes, which we've kind of talked about as we've gone along. So take a look at the golf course, taking a look at Alhambra Main Street, it looks like, some other changes in industrial and commercial areas near transit. Susie, that's a great comment. That's certainly a solution that we'll be taking a look at. So so all around solid responses. Applause to the city of Alhambra residents.
I know, absolutely, yeah. And I don't know if you mentioned, I saw Valley Boulevard in there, the Valley Boulevard corridor, which, of course, we know that we are, aggressively looking at, as a possibility for rezoning, for a lot of reasons, not only for housing, but just to improve the overall area in general. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and of course taking the time to provide such valuable information. Always helpful. You always get a little something more out of these presentations. I want to thank the members of the committee that came out tonight and participated, that listened. I think at this point where we stand, it is extremely important for us to come together, put our heads together, share opinions as to the direction that the city needs to take in terms of housing and meeting these RHNA numbers. And so, I definitely encourage all of you to, pass the word and let people know that this is happening, that this is something that is going to probably one of the biggest things and one of the biggest changes that is going to affect Alhambra in years to come. It's not an immediate thing, but I think we'll be feeling and seeing the changes, in the next 4 or 5, 10 years, et cetera. So very important for all of us to get involved, to create those, you become a part of the forums that are put together. I know this is one of the first of maybe many town halls that we're going to be doing regarding this topic and other topics. But I did, of course, read a comment from the Main Street Alliance earlier, where they're going to be putting together a forum with different resources and invitations from local leaders that are going to speak on this topic. So I definitely encourage you to pass the word and attend where and if you can. And most importantly, I think I want everybody to know that I can speak for myself, and I think for the rest of council, that we are available. We are here for your thoughts, opinions, comments, regarding this topic, of course, which is vital, and anything else. So, reach out by email, by telephone, if you can, any way that you'd like. Join these meetings and pass the word. And again, I thank you for making yourselves available tonight. Thank you. And with that, if there's nothing else, no other questions, nobody else raising their hands, I think that will conclude it. So again, any other questions that comes up after the fact, feel free to reach out directly, and we will get them addressed. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
You too.